You have that? And so we welcome this morning Ariana Neumann. She grew up in Venezuela. She now lives in London, so it's mid-afternoon there. And I connected with Ariana after hearing her story on a podcast. You all hear me talk about podcasts all the time, and these are amazing radio shows. And I heard her sharing the story about her father, which is in her memoir that she wrote called When Time Stopped. And she spoke to us, I think, a little over a year ago, and is so gracious with her time, with her energy, and with her knowledge, sharing her story. And as we have been working on our butterfly project, I'm going to add my spotlight, and if we could go to camera 2. Or camera 1. I can't even know which camera I'm on these days. As we've been working on this butterfly project, and the butterfly project is a program out of San Diego that was started in San Diego. It's now worldwide. And the goal of the butterfly project is to make a ceramic butterfly that it is displayed in the world for all of the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. There are about 350,000 of these. And the Community One initiative, which is part of our Temple Beth Shalom Foundation, that was initiated by members of our congregation who said, here is an opportunity to make a difference in the world. And so they stepped forward and they gave us resources to be able to do this initiative in our community, to do Holocaust education, and all of the things that it implies. That how do we give people an opportunity to learn about empathy, to care about not bullying in our world, about how to protect the smallest of those in our world. It has led to many initiatives, including the Living Voices program in our middle schools, and now the Butterfly Project. The Butterfly Project comes from a book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly. There is a poem that you might have seen me write a post about it. Pavel Friedman wrote a poem called The Last Butterfly. And so in San Diego, the Butterfly Project was born, saying, here is this young man who was in the Theresienstadt ghetto. He wrote this beautiful poem, which we'll have a chance to hear about, and that led to this project. So we're going to get to the last butterfly in the Butterfly Project, but this leads me to welcoming Ariana this morning, or afternoon, depending on where you're sitting. I remember, as we were doing the Butterfly Project, we weren't talking about the Theresienstadt ghetto very much. There were some mentions of it, and I myself have a limited knowledge. And then I remembered that Ariana has, part of her family story weaves through that time and that place. And so I reached out to her and she said, yes, I'm actually making one of those presentations. And so here in our little shul in the woods, we welcome Ariana Neumann to share her family story, but also to share with us, to give us some sense of the Theresienstadt ghetto, of how that was part of the story of the Shoah, and to help us as we bring these butterflies with all of their beauty, with all of the energy it's taking to create them, to bring that into our space so we know more of that story. So Ariana, welcome. Thank you so much. She is incredibly gracious and wonderful, and so we welcome you to Temple Beth Shalom this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Michael. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to me. It is a huge honor to speak to you today. It's a huge honor to speak about Theresienstadt, really. And as Rabbi Michael has said, I actually didn't know very much about my family story, and I didn't know I had any connection at all to Theresienstadt until relatively recently in my life. But let me start by sharing my screen, because hopefully this will, hold on one second. There we go. Let me just go in there. Sorry, this is, let's go slideshow. There we go. Hopefully, I'm hoping, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So I'm here today to tell you about Terezin. I call it Terezin and not Theresienstadt. And but it's obviously it's the same thing. The reason I call it Terezin is because that is the Czech name. Theresienstadt is what the Germans called it. I don't like to call things by what the Germans called or the Nazis called the place. And I also think it's important as we talk about this years on, if we call it Theresienstadt, it sort of absolves the locals in Terezin a little bit of their responsibility in the Shoah. So I'm going to call it Terezin, but please feel free to call it whatever you feel comfortable calling it. And in most of the media in America, it is called Theresienstadt. So let me start, perhaps if I give you a little overview. Hold on one second. We're going to be talking about Theresienstadt. Terezin is actually a place just outside of Prague. It's actually closer to 40 miles outside of Prague, so forgive the 30 miles there. But we're going to, and it's a little town, so it's been there for hundreds of years, but we're going to be talking about it between November 1941 and May 1945. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to do so that you sort of know how long this is going to go on for and what it is I'm actually talking about. So I don't know how much you know about the war in Czechoslovakia, so I'm going to give you a little overview. Then I'm going to tell you specifically a little bit about Terezin. Then I'm going to move on to my personal connection to Theresienstadt. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the children and the butterflies. And I hope to speak to you for about 30 minutes. If I start droning on, please, Rabbi Michael, scratch your head or let me know somehow that I'm going on too long. But let's start with a little bit about the war. And let me also, actually, before I tell you that, I'd like to tell you that I'm not an expert on Theresienstadt as such. I trained as a historian. I have been researching it for 10 years because it turns out that pretty much every member of my Czech family passed through there. So it's something that was very important to me, both from a personal point of view and I suppose from the point of view of the book. But I usually don't talk about Theresienstadt specifically. So if this is a little disjointed or a little long, please forgive me. What I can tell you is that I actually visited Theresienstadt in 17 and 18. In 18, I went actually with my children and my husband and my mother, and it is a place that if you go to Prague is very easy to visit and that you should visit. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me just, sorry, I have this in the wrong place. So I don't know if you know, but in 1939, the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia. And pretty quickly, they passed hundreds and hundreds of laws. And they are laws that had been passed in Germany. In Czechoslovakia, they start being passed pretty much at the rate of 2 or 3 a week. And they're seemingly petty laws at first. They ban Jews from working in certain areas, from shopping outside of certain hours, from owning businesses, from owning pretty random objects like umbrellas and pets. And then they move on to radios and typewriters. And these laws were really small. And individually, they were hard to protest against, right? Because what are you going to say? It's outrageous. Like, why do I have to turn in my umbrella? But taken together, they become hundreds of laws, and they successfully dehumanize Jews, basically, and make it easier for them to lose all their belongings, to lose their sense of identity, to lose a sense of nationality. They lose their jobs, and eventually people think it's okay to label them and completely exclude them, and then eventually transport them to different places. By October 1941, it's obvious that the Germans have a campaign, but they're not quite sure about how to do it, and how it is that they're going to exterminate the Jews. but they decide that they need to move them away from the ghettos. Please forgive me, I have dogs barking, but they need to move them away from the ghettos and from the towns and basically put them in camps. Okay, so they decide that Terezin is going to be the answer to this problem. So it's going to become a transport camp. And if you look at the map, hold on one second. Sorry, it's not, there we go. So if you look at the map, and I don't know if it's large enough in your screen, but it's basically in the center. So if you look at Prague, Terezin is just a little bit to the north of that. And it's very convenient because you can round up the German Jews and the Austrian Jews and eventually the Jews from Holland and France and put them all through this transit ghetto of Terezin and then deport them further east to Auschwitz, to the other death camps. Now, Terezin is actually located 40 miles outside of Prague. And it's not a traditional looking camp. As a matter of fact, it was a place where the nobles in the 18th century would go and sort of escape the summer heat. And if you look at it from above, that picture is taken probably in the spring, so it looks lush and rather beautiful. It doesn't really look, I mean, I don't know what your image of a camp is, but it doesn't look like, it certainly didn't look like my traditional image of a camp. It looks more like a European fortified town. And if you look at the next slide, this is a map of Theresienstadt when it was already a camp, so in 1944. And you can see it sort of arranged a bit like a village, like a traditional European village around a market square. If you go there, there was even a sort of church that was obviously locked up. And there are workshops, and there's even a post office. So it's rather extraordinary, or at least I thought it was rather extraordinary when I first encountered it. Now, Theresienstadt, the reason it's extraordinary is because it is actually indeed very different to other camps. So it was originally built by Emperor Joseph II in the 18th century as a fortified army barracks for about 6,000 soldiers were expected to live there. 6,000 in total between soldiers and people in the village. Initially, it was set up as a transit camp for Jews from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, so from that certain area of Czechoslovakia. And later, when German and Austrian Jews arrived, its function changed into that of a ghetto for the elderly and as a camp for the privileged. So there were a lot, obviously, of very learned Jewish people who were very successful. There were lots of famous doctors, and I mean Einstein. There were lots of famous, but I mean not that Einstein was in Theresienstadt. There were lots of famous household names, and the Nazis thought, okay, we need to eliminate them all. But if we disappear these people, we're going to have a problem. So maybe we should just say that we're putting them in a ghetto with a post office so they can communicate. A ghetto where we can pretend there is some sort of semblance of normality for the outside world. So it's used sort of for propaganda purposes. And as a matter of fact, in 1944, it's displayed to the Red Cross as, look, this is where we have elderly Jewish people, and look, it's really not that bad. I think this is the only camp actually that was displayed to the outside world. It's also different than the other camps that you may have heard of because it has no gas chambers. Many died there, but those that died there did so of illness and starvation. And then because it housed all these important, well-known people, there were many artists and scholars and people who were very well known incarcerated there. And that created a very unique society and a unique environment, because there were these people obviously created many cultural activities, both for adults and for children. And because they actually were given a tiny little bit more food than in Auschwitz, they were allowed to bring 50 kilos of belongings rather than the 25 kilos that you were allowed to bring to Auschwitz. There was a little bit of more of a normal, and I use normal with quotes, life there. Hold on 1 second. Now, at the same time, it was, and in most ways, it was very much like any other camp. So this is one of the entrances. You may recognize the phrase above. It's the same as in many other camps. It's the same as in Auschwitz, and it's the same lie told to the Jews by the Nazis, that work makes you free. So you should be under no illusion that people there were in prison, they were tortured, they were scared, they died of malnutrition, they were surrounded by dirt and vermin, and they lived with the ever-present fear of being deported to the East. And there's a lot of debate about how much people knew. But I can tell you that my family, for example, knew that they had to do everything possible to avoid being transported east. And there's a real fear in these letters that I'll talk about in a little bit about what would happen if they went. So they feared this place, the camps to the east, to be deadly. And they were constantly threatened, everybody in Theresienstadt, with being deported. So the fear was very, very real. Now, this image that I'm showing you is a reconstruction. It's actually from a photograph from Theresienstadt now. It's a reconstruction of the barracks. You can see how crowded it is. At the same time, I don't think it gives you a real sense that you would get if you read memoirs or accounts of people that were there. You have to imagine the clothes weren't nicely hung, they weren't clean. There were often 3 people to a bed. There were bed bugs and lice, and these were pretty grim conditions. Now, over 33,000 people died in Terezin of diseases and malnutrition. And so many people died in Terezin, actually, that they had to build a special crematorium to dispose of the bodies, because they just couldn't do so many burials per day. And if you do the maths, and maths is not my forte, so please forgive me, I think we're talking about 30 people dying every day in the camp. I mean, the numbers are pretty horrific. Because it was used as a transit camp, there were over 144,000 people sent there from all over Europe, including 15,000 children. And many just transited through there. In 1943, it actually held over 55,000 people inside the camp. And remember, that's a camp built for around 6,000. At the end of the war, there were about 17,000 survivors of Theresienstadt, including 130 children. So of the 15,000, 130 had survived the war. Now, there are many depictions of life in Theresienstadt. There was this marvelous Czech artist. He was a political cartoonist. He was born in 1906. He was called Bedřich Fritta, and he did some remarkable drawings of life there. And this is one of the ones that I think is the most telling. You can see the sadness in people's faces. You can see the misery, and you can see this little child. I don't know if you can see it in the middle, with these huge eyes, these eyes of awe, really. I think everyone else is, anyways, I just find it very, very moving, so I thought I would include it here. Now, this is a brief timeline of Terezin and the things that happened to do with Terezin. The first transports to the camp arrive in 1941. Pretty quickly, so in January 1942, people start getting transported out onto labor camps and the killing sites. They go to Riga first, and then by the end of 1942, they're transporting people to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then in 1944, there's this rather remarkable visit, which is the Red Cross delegation visit. And I want to talk a little bit about this because it's quite extraordinary in the history of Theresienstadt. So it's a complete charade, right? In 1944, in response to pressure from Denmark, because the Nazis were transporting, I think it was 500 Jews from Denmark to Terezin, the Danish government said, we need to see where you're taking them. And they organize a delegation of the Red Cross, of the Danish foreign minister. And they arrange a visit. So they say, fine, come to Theresienstadt in 3 months. And they basically set out to beautify the camp. Okay, so they order the prisoners to pave streets, to repair housing, to paint the houses, to build a playground. They even plant 1,200 rose bushes. They have women clean the dirt from the road with their own hairbrushes. And to make it seem less crowded, just before the Red Cross arrive, they transport 7,500 young men and women to their deaths at Auschwitz. And what is remarkable to me, and I think is a very important lesson to keep in mind, is that the people from the Red Cross go there and they spend 6 hours there. And it was obviously done in a way, I mean, there were SS milling about. It wasn't like the prisoners could say, look, we're being tortured, please, get us out of here. But I think people see what they want to see. And it must have been, if you had wanted to see the horrors, if you had listened to the stories that were coming out of the area, it should have been obvious that something horrific was going on. And yet it wasn't. The Red Cross left and said, it's completely fine. Now, let me go to the next slide. There we are. The majority of people are actually, the most number of transports out of Terezin happen in September and October 1944. The Germans by then know that they're losing the war, and they decide that this is their last try, their last chance to murder as many people as they can. So they actually ship in those months 18,000 people to Auschwitz. That includes my grandfather and my grandmother, who were sent, one in September and one in October. And then the other thing, of course, is the other thing that's interesting is that camp is actually liberated in May 1945 by the International Red Cross, the ones that had been there in less than a year prior. But it's also liberated by the Soviets. So it's actually the Russian army that liberates the camp. And the other thing of interest really is that there's actually quite a lot of people in Theresienstadt by then, because as the camps east were liberated by the Soviets and people were forced on death marches, they started arriving in Theresienstadt. So in about April 1945, in addition to the prisoners that you already had in Theresienstadt that had been there from before, 15,000 arrived. And this brought with it a lot more disease. So a lot of people in Theresienstadt actually ended up dying in the last months just before liberation. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, so as I said before, in terms of transports, September and October 1944 were the worst months in terms of numbers, sheer numbers. And my grandparents, Otto and Ella, so were there. They spent 2 whole years in Terezin before being transported out. And I basically, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my grandparents. And my Czech family, I now know because I was never told about them at all as a child or even as an adult. My father simply couldn't talk about them. It consisted of 34 people. 29 of those people were sent to camps. All of them that were sent from Czechoslovakia, so all of my family passed through Terezin. Some spent a few hours there on their way to Sobibor. So if you look at the photograph of the group of people on the right, that's actually my grandmother in the middle, and she's surrounded by her siblings and their spouses. And all of the people in that photograph, actually, it just struck me as I posted it, all of them died in the Holocaust. And actually, most of them spent, aside from my grandmother, who spent 2 years, everyone else spent 2 hours in Terezin on their way to the extermination camp of Sobibor. But anyways, so of my family, of 34, of the 29 that were sent away, 4 survived. And I'm not going to overwhelm you with pictures of all of them, but I thought it would be nice for you to see the faces of the people that I'm talking about. Now, my grandparents, Otto and Ella, had a paint factory outside of Prague. They were a very normal middle-class family. They had 2 boys. Their eldest was called Lothar, my uncle Lothar. He was 21 when the war started. And their youngest was my father, Hans. He was 18 when the war started. And they both managed to avoid being transported by all sorts of ruses and adventures. And that's, if you're interested, you can read my book. But they basically managed to stay behind. And my grandmother was transported first to Theresienstadt from Prague, and my grandfather was transported a few months later. So my grandmother arrived in May, my grandfather arrived in November 1944. Now, the family were very, very lucky because my uncle Lothar was married to this incredible woman who was a Gentile, so she wasn't Jewish, which of course protected her. And she was fiercely brave and independent. And one of the things that she did for the family is she provided them with food, and she provided them with medicine, and she provided them with the ability to communicate with each other before they were transported, because they were not allowed to travel, so she could deliver messages. But later on in the war, after my grandmother is transported, she sets up a system of contraband. So she has access to money because she was relatively well off, and she had a farm, and she had access to food, and she was incredibly brave. So she would basically wrap up these parcels of food and hair dye for my grandfather because he had white hair, and if you appeared too old, then you were sent to your death. So hair dye and currency often, and clothes, and she would arrange these parcels. She would take them to a little village just by Theresienstadt, where a lady would pick up these parcels of goods. She would probably take some of the things inside the parcel for herself, and then she would sneak them in. She was doing, we think she was doing the laundry for the SS in the camp. So she would bring in these sort of, carts of laundry. Inside the carts of laundry would be hidden these little parcels that she would take from my grandmother and eventually my grandfather too. And more importantly for me was the fact that she snuck out letters from my grandparents. So this was a huge thing for me because as I didn't get to know them, having their letters meant that I had a window into their soul, even though they were obviously very difficult letters to read because of the circumstances that they found themselves in. But this is thanks. All of this is thanks to Stenka, who was very brave. She was so brave. She actually snuck. At some stage, the courier couldn't deliver the parcel, and she was worried about my grandfather in 1944 not having hair dye, and she snuck into the camp, and she also snuck into the camp in the summer of 1943. So she was a very brave, very righteous woman. Now, to give you an idea, this is a letter. So because there was a post office, it was a pretend post office, and there was a pretend, there were all sorts of pretend things in Theresienstadt. But inmates could actually send letters. Now these letters were censored and they could only be 25 words long. And then in addition to that, they were delayed. So if you sent a letter in February, you were lucky if the person got it by December. And this is what an official letter from Theresienstadt looked like. But if you look at the letters that I have from my grandparents, that's what a letter from my grandfather looked like. And I have about 35 letters, some from my grandmother, some from my grandfather, but you can see that pretty much every little bit of paper is covered with words. And I suppose I'm very lucky to have these things because they describe the conditions in this camp. And if I didn't have these letters, I wouldn't, I would just imagine this camp to be a place with, a post office and a place with a pretend bank. They even had pretend currency, which was completely valueless, but people were paid with this fake Theresian money, which had an image of Moses on it, and a Star of David, and which was completely valueless. I mean, you couldn't do anything with the currency except perhaps attend a concert, which I'm sure was a nice distraction, but didn't really feed you. The other thing of note, as I'm talking about the pretend things in Theresienstadt, is there was a hospital. And actually, that was not a pretend hospital at all, but probably the best hospital in Europe, because all of the famous doctors from Vienna and Berlin and Prague and Krakow had ended up in Theresienstadt, which actually meant that the medical care in Theresienstadt, ironically, was absolutely superb. And a lot of SS people that were wounded chose to actually go and be treated in the hospital there. Anyways, but if I didn't have my grandparents' letters, I wouldn't know, I suppose, about the miserable conditions that they, and the misery really, and the sadness that they went through on a daily basis. So I'm just going to share with you a few quotes. These are actually the terrible ones are from my grandfather, because my grandfather was much more, he focused on detail and on things like this. My grandmother tried to be joyful and positive and hopeful. So my grandfather's letters describe all sorts of things, and there's a line where he's talking about how people are fighting over food, and how instead of just trying to share, they behave like animals. He says that people almost seem like they're no longer people, and that even women, they're so malnourished that they don't even get their periods anymore. And he really describes absolutely horrific conditions. At some stage, he sort of says, I'm really lucky because I'm in my bunk and I actually get to share it with someone I know who was actually his nephew. And he said most people are just sharing bunks with people they don't know. And again, we only have bed bugs in our barracks. Most people have bed bugs and lice. So there's all sorts of things like that my grandfather describes. And as well as the cruelty, and again, you can really sense in his letters the constant threat of being transported east. My grandmother, on the other hand, doesn't talk about these details quite so much. I think it had to do with her personality. I think she didn't want to horrify her boys outside. And yet even my grandfather, in his letters, manages to focus on the small joys. So there's a whole description that he gives about how he feels incredibly lucky one day in 1944 because the person in front of him drops a dumpling, like a little dumpling a Czech dumpling that they would give you with a sort of watery soup. And because he's just newly arrived, this person in front of my grandfather, he just looks at the dumpling and it's dirty and he just leaves it there. And my grandfather says, I was so lucky. All of a sudden, I had this dumpling covered in dirt, and it didn't matter that it was covered in dirt. Eating it transported me to a memory of dumplings before the war and of how happy they made me then, and just the memory was enough to sustain me. So it's interesting to me that despite all the horrors that the letters describe, my grandmother is constantly talking about the flowers, and she's constantly talking about the spring and how seeing flowers and how seeing butterflies, ironically she talks about in one of the letters, reminds her of their country house. And it's by focusing on these little things actually that my grandparents managed to retain some sense of humanity and to retain hope. And they actually every single letter just says, we're going to be okay. Don't worry about us. And we are going to be together again soon. And I think this is what keeps them going for as long as it does. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a boy in family, and talking about children in Theresienstadt. And I just wanted to tell you, he was, I think, the youngest member of my father's family to spend time in Terezin. He was my father's cousin. He was born in 1927, and Jerry was a gifted poet. I mean, he wrote poetry, I think, from the age of 7. And the family still have a lot of his poems from before the war. And he was transported to Terezin in 1941, so very early on. And in Terezin, he continued writing, and he was there for 2 years. And that's a picture of him, obviously, outside of Terezin when he was a little boy. Now, that's a picture of him a little bit older, so just before actually being deported to Terezin. Sorry, and I said 1941 before. He was actually transported in 1942, forgive me, in January 1942. And he spent about 18 months in Theresienstadt, and then he was transported to Auschwitz on the 6th of September 1943, where he was gassed on arrival, we think. And again, just to drive home the numbers and the point of 15,000 children, only 138 survived Terezin. But my cousin Jirka, Jerry Pollock, he was called Jirka. His poems are part of the exhibit at the Jewish Museum in Prague. So the poems that he wrote before the war are held by the family, and the poems that he wrote during Terezin are in the exhibit at the Jewish Museum in Prague still to today. So it's wonderful to know that those survived the war. Now, much of the artwork done by the children in Terezin, the ones that survived and the ones that didn't survive, is exhibited in museums around the world, and particularly so in the Jewish Museum in Prague and in Terezin. There's whole rooms dedicated to the children in Terezin. And it was interesting because I think I mean, we always try to protect our children, and it was no different in Terezin. So the inmates tried to give the kids as normal a life as they could. They taught them maths. They had them act and sing and write and draw. And many of these poems and these drawings survive. And we now know, actually, and I've spoken to 3 boys who are no longer boys, they're in their 90s, but who were boys in Terezin. And 2 of them actually had put together a comic book, and another one had a newsletter that was written a bit like a newspaper, right, for the kids of Terezin about things that were going on. And there was a lot of humor in all these things, and a lot of them, again, have survived. This particular drawing, I just included it because it has a butterfly, and it was painted by Margit Koretsova, who died at the age of 10. And so I guess butterflies, right? That's what we're doing for Yom HaShoah. We're remembering, we're using butterflies because, well, for all sorts of reasons. I suppose the one main reason is in 1959, they put together a book of poems, some of the poems that had been saved from Terezin. And what is interesting is that a lot of the people actually hid, before they were deported, hid things inside Terezin. So before leaving, they hid things behind bricks, behind walls, underneath floorboards. So until very recently, they were still digging up things like, plays and music scores. One of the composers in Terezin composed operas, actually. But in 1959, they already had a selection of poems of the kids written by the children of Terezin, and they published this wonderful book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, which is based, as Rabbi Michael said, on the poem by Pavel Friedman, which was written in 1942. And Pavel Friedman, I think, was there then about 21. He was born in 1921. And I'm not going to read you the whole poem, but I think it's important to read the last lines, and here they are. For 7 weeks, I've lived in here, pent up inside this ghetto, but I have found my people here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut candles in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Because butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto. So it's particularly poignant, I think, to note that this year marks the 80th anniversary of Pavel Friedman's deportation to Terezin. It also marks the 80th anniversary of my cousin Jerka's deportation to Terezin. And butterflies, obviously, are key to this. They're key because poor Pavel Friedman never sees another butterfly in the camp. But they also symbolize, in every culture around the world, they symbolize change and they symbolize renewal. And I think they're symbols of hope and beauty, right? So I'm going to leave you with 2 quotes, or I'm going to not quite leave you yet, but I'm going to, I think, just because I find this incredibly sad and incredibly just dark, I think it's important to remember that even in this darkness, you find light. And even in, these beautiful poems are created in a place of darkness. And yet here we are 80 years later reading them, right? And remembering. And that is what light is about, right? So Anne Frank was never in Terezin, but she was one of the children that died in the Holocaust. And she wrote in her diary that where there's hope, there's life. And it fills us with fresh courage and it makes us strong again. So I think as we remember these stories, I think as we tell these stories, I think as we look to the future and we look around us with wars and terrible things going on, we must remember to have hope. Because if we lose that, we lose everything. And then Elie Wiesel, who is, I think, my favorite writer of all the writers of the Holocaust, who also survived the camps. And if you haven't read Night, please, it's beautiful. Please, please do. Reminds us that every moment is a new beginning, right? So every moment we can choose to be hopeful, to renew, to do things differently, to do things better. Now, forgive me, I'm going to have to move this a little bit there. Perfect. My cousin Jerka wrote a poem, and because he's my cousin, I'm going to read it to you. Because I think amongst many things, it is about hope. I might get a little teary, so please forgive me. It's called The Storm. The heavens sense our burden, the threat of future downpours I carry on my back. We are drunk on wine vinegar. The nearing storm rouses me. It makes me want to shake the world. We are an assembly of misery. If our hands are bloody, it is from the blood of our own wounds. The grotesque scars we bear on our bodies testify to battles fought, battles that went unrecognized. But the next storm will unfurl our flag and uproot the rotted trees. Then we, together with a gusting wind, will scale Spielberg's heights and will stand in victory on the peaks of cliffs, our hair blowing freely in the wind. So that's it. I just want to end with this poem from my cousin Jerka, which also was included in I Never Saw a Butterfly, at least on the edition in 1959. Because I think you can see that despite the cruelty, despite the injustice of what happened to them, these souls still managed to produce beauty and to retain hope, and to show us really that they can imprison our bodies and they can torture us, but really they can't imprison our minds and they can't destroy our humanity. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm sorry if I went a little bit too long.
I don't think any apology is necessary in any way, shape, or form. We've got all of our attention here, I'm guessing, everyone additionally on Zoom, and I don't think we can thank you enough for, and this is the challenge of talking about the Shoah, of how do we turn it from an I-it, that we're just talking about something in history, to really feeling the humanity of each of these. We talk about 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis, and we see that big number, and it's easy to get lost. And Ariana, you have done in such an amazing way of doing what I had hoped, and which was making this, this is your family story. It's a lot of our family story, as I've shared with my congregation. My family was one of those that was able to get away, that my grandfather left in the late 30s and with my grandmother from Switzerland, and how many families didn't have that opportunity. So thank you so much. And I of course marked about 5 poems in Another Butterfly, and Jerka's was one of those. As I was looking through, it was like, I'm just curious. But sure enough, that very poem was one of the ones that caught my attention as I was going through. So thank you so much. I do look out to our community that's with us on Zoom and to the folks who are here in our sanctuary. If anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, I know that, and I caught my attention a couple of weeks ago as we were talking about The Last Butterfly with the young people from our congregation. I looked and I saw for Pavel Friedman that he was transported to Terezin on April 26, 1942, and we were there. It was April 24th when I said that, 2 days to the 80th anniversary of that moment. Anybody have any questions? We are going to have a moment of service, of worship, of being able to say Kaddish and light a light of memory, because that's really vital and important in these moments. Before we also then do something in this, in Ariana, you've talked about the nechemta, that how do we create, even in those moments of pain and loss, how do we infuse them with hope? Not saying that out of something bad, something's got to come, or not that, but in response. It's not that, oh, there's something bad, so we bring something good. It's, I'm going to push back and protest, and when I see that brokenness, when I see that darkness, that surus, that yetzer hara in such incredible ways, how my response is l'chaim, I'm going to bring life, which is very much what you are doing so many ways. And then we also say, may your memory be for a blessing. That in Judaism, we just don't think. We don't even stop with just telling the story. We turn it into action. What are we going to do to take brokenness and find sparks of God's holiness to make people's memories? Ariana, you're giving us those incredible numbers that 29 members of your family were deported, and 4, you said, survived?
Correct.
The numbers, 15,000 children went through Teresian, 138 survived. How do we, in our day and age, how do we honor that? How do we feel it? And how do we say we're going to create a world where that doesn't happen again? And that is a part and parcel of the Butterfly Project. One of the things, why are there crematoria? Because Hitler was trying to destroy their presence in the world. And what did we do? We took clay from Earth's 4 corners, we're giving it the breath of life, turning it into something powerful, so that when people see these butterflies, they say, wait, what are these butterflies? And and that's what we do as Jews. When people ask the question, what do? We tell the story. We keep the names alive, we keep the stories alive. How many of us now will be offering these poems and offering these memories? Are there questions from our folks on Zoom? A few of the folks are saying sincere thanks for your presentation. Thank you so much for providing that very meaningful experience. It's impossible to find words for how meaningful this has been. Sad, heartbreaking, despair was our portion, but I thank you. Questions? And I know, and Ariana, I'm going to ask, I know tomorrow you're speaking as well. Where are you speaking tomorrow?
I am speaking to some people in Canada. And it's, sorry, I'm breaking up here. I hope you can hear me. I'm speaking to some people in Toronto, to a congregation there. So
we become part of a larger community. I'll also tell you that Get When Time Stopped, Ariana's book, is absolutely incredible and beautiful. And actually her interview, I think, is on our Temple Beth Shalom YouTube channel from last year. If you want to see some of those pictures, even just beyond the book, but it is beautiful. Any questions? I know I was struck by that image that you showed of the Teresian compound, of the complex there. I guess I think ghetto, that's definitely not what I envisioned. And I remember reading that it was a place that was, you even had that, it was for like 5,000 or 6,000 people, and there were tens of thousands of people crammed into that space. And at what point, 1,200 children arrived on transport, and they were put into a special hospital area. No one was really allowed to go to them except for a few doctors. And they found out that these were the kids from Bialystok. These were the 1,200 children that survived after the people started to revolt. The Jews started to revolt in the ghetto. The Nazis raised the ghetto. These were the last 1,200 kids that had survived. They show up dirty, traumatized, full of lice and bed bugs and everything else, and eventually were taken to Auschwitz to their death. Too many stories like that in that place, and yet here we have a chance to feel it as Ellen is saying, and now to do an act of response. Why? Thank you, Ellen. I don't know if you can see the chat, Ariana.
I can. And I mean, I think, Ellen, you're absolutely right. How can people do this to people, right? How can people do this to children? How can, I mean, to me, the most horrifying thing and is the fact that these were people in Europe. They were educated, they were rich, they had everything at their, these were not, these were people with, philosophy degrees. These were people with high school and university educations, and they somehow, and they were people with families. They were people that I'm sure if you saw them on the street on a Sunday in the park would be playing with their kids, and somehow they could turn around, be seemingly normal human people and do this to others. And that I find that very scary. And I wish I knew why. And because if I knew why, then we could make sure it doesn't happen again, right? So I think we just have to keep on telling the stories, right? Like Rabbi Michael, even if we don't understand why, we just hope that it somehow we're putting a little grain of salt, putting a little bit of light that somehow will make the world make a different place.
And I think as Ariana, as you say that, my thought is going to I never saw another butterfly. In Dresdenstadt, there were art classes taught by well-known artists. One of them was a remarkable figure, Friedel Dicker Brandeis. Vienna-born and Bauhaus-trained secularist, communist, a painter of portrait and landscapes, an immigrant to Prague and later a Czech citizen, an active anti-fascist who felt her place was in Europe, turned down a visa that would have enabled her to enter Palestine. Friedel Dicker Brandeis came in December 1942, a resident of Dresdenstadt. Her tastes were sophisticated, managed somehow under those terrible conditions to make a livable space out of the tiny under-the-staircase closet she occupied. Others expected and received compensation in bread. She would accept no payment for her teaching. She would go from group to group, calmly, instinctively teaching, though she had no pedagogical education. The children waited for her quietly, eagerly. She did not know Czech and spoke only German. It didn't matter. She taught her way and herself had been taught by her art teachers in Vienna and the Bauhaus. Breathing and rhythm, the study of reproduction, texture, color, values, the importance of observation, patience, and freeing oneself from the outer world of numbing routine and the inner world of dread. She would tell stories, and the children would be required to draw the objects she mentioned. They drew butterflies and flowers, animals, cities, storms, straits. They drew their concealed inner world. They drew their concealed inner world and tortured emotions, which Friedel Dickerson was then able to enter and try to heal. She helped restore a balance to the trembling consciousness of the children. They created over 5,000 drawings and collages. She herself drew very little. And one of the things they said is that they convinced the Germans to have this because they said it was an art school, and what they were really running there was a treatment center. They were using the art as a way of caring for and helping these really traumatized and shattered kids. Bill Compton's asking how many of your family survived and where did they end up?
So of my family of 34, 29 ended up in camps. The ones that didn't end up in camps, 2 were in America. So there were my great uncle and my two great uncles of mine ended up in America. One left in 1920 and the other one in 1938. My family tried to emigrate to America, but they were never granted visas. Of the 29 that went to and my father was never in a camp because he absconded from a transport, as did his brother eventually. Of the 29 that were in camps, 4 survived. None of the children survived, but the 4 that survived were all in their 20s and 30s. They ended up going from Theresienstadt. One survived Riga, which is in Latvia, which is one of the worst camps possible. He was one of, I think, 120 survivors, and he stayed in the town that he was from. He was called Eric, and he was my father's cousin, and he stayed in the Czech Republic. The other three were three siblings. They were actually the siblings of Jiří Polák, the little boy that wrote the poem, and they were the older siblings, and they survived Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. One ended up in Israel, and he committed suicide in 1958 after going to Yad Vashem and giving all the names. His two sisters also survived, and they lived in Czechoslovakia and eventually moved to Switzerland in 1968. And my father and his brother, who weren't in camps, so they were saved. They didn't see all these horrors that their cousins did, ended up emigrating to Venezuela. I think that's basically the 34.
And the question, one of the questions is, how did they get away? If
How did my parents? Sorry, how
did your father get away?
Oh, my father, he was pretty daring and crazy. So he decided, they sort of played the system, and he got off the first two transports that he was in by having the person that he was employed by declare that he was crucial to the war effort. When the third notice came in that he was going to be transported, and he knew there was no way of getting any document to save him, he decided he was going to abscond from the transport. So simply he wasn't going to show up. That was very risky because it meant that the Gestapo immediately placed you on their wanted list. And because he was completely insane, my father, he decided that actually he was hidden in Prague for a little bit, but he figured that he was wanted by the Gestapo in Prague. So the best thing for him to do would be to go to the one place where no one would think a Jew from Prague would go and hide, which is Berlin. So he went in May 1943 to Berlin, pretended to be someone other than Hans Neumann, who was my father, pretended to have nothing to do with Judaism, and lived in Berlin, working in a factory that was producing lacquers for the V-2 bomber and for the Luftwaffe from May 1943 to April 1945. And that's how he survived. That's how he got away. My uncle was protected by being in a mixed marriage for a little bit to this wonderful woman, Zdenka, who snuck the parcels in. And then he actually ended up working for the elders. So I don't know if you know this, but the Nazis set up a whole system of self-governance. Of course, it wasn't governance. These people had but there were elders in charge of deporting people and taking away the belongings and administering the camp, for example, in Terezin. My grandfather, my uncle worked for a year in Prague when there were very few Jews left in Prague, but because he was protected by being married, he was allowed to stay in Prague until January 1945. He then had to write his own deportation note, and he also absconded. So he was hidden by his girlfriend Zdenka until the end of the war. So that's how they absconded.
Quite an adventure trying to connect with Zdenka.
It was quite an adventure trying to connect to Zdenka. She, it was incredible because she's such a hero in the story. And no one in my family had ever spoken about it. Now, I came along in the 70s, so, people were really not talking about the war, but I still thought she's so incredible. Why has no one talked to me about it? And it's a very long story, but I eventually tracked her down by tracking down her first boyfriend, who was this incredible guy who helped me out, who was in Switzerland, who had also, and I didn't track Zdenka down, I tracked Zdenka's daughter down. And she is an absolutely beautiful soul who lives in Switzerland, because after the Prague Spring, a lot of Czechs left, a lot of Czechs that were involved in the opposition to the communists left after the Prague Spring in 1968, they ended up, my cousins and actually Stenka all together ended up in Switzerland. And I tracked Stenka's daughter in Switzerland. She's called Lucy, and she's an absolutely beautiful human being. And I was very lucky that Stenka had written a lot about her adventures. So it was strange because this woman in Switzerland who I had never met, Lucy, knew more about my family when I tracked her down than I did.
Ariana, you live in London.
I do, sadly. Well, today it's very sunny, so I'm very happy to live in London today.
So thank you so much. I can't really actually even say thank you enough that you are just so gracious with your time and energy to share your family story with us, because I think it helps us as we have these days of memory, not just say, oh, here's a day on the calendar, but to really feel the weight, even to the smallest bit of measure, but also I think to take it and hear those stories of how people did take care of each other in all of this darkness, to be able to honor people's memory and to turn memory into blessing. Ariana, you're more than welcome to stay with us. If you are able, we're going to do a short service, and then we're going to do our act of bringing forward our butterflies. And so we're just going to shift the spotlight here.
Thank you.
Yes, so you'll pull the CG off, or the computer over. I did. This is where we get to the exciting part of, and then if you could just make the PowerPoint active, Cantor. I'm just going to keep going.
You're going to keep going?
Yep, but if we can come back to that at the end. The flickering memorial candle, they capture a state of in-between, of mourn but don't stop living. Don't forget, but don't get lost in memory. Act, but not out of anger over injustice, but in love and kindness, bringing justice into our still fragmented world. And we read together, just as God's first action was to bring light into the universe God created, it is light calling us to remember and to act. We work together in act. It is custom to light a Yisker candle on these special days of memory, to restore the light of presence of those killed to this world, if even but for a second, to bring light to us at this moment of prayer, meditation, and memory, to recognize how the victims of intolerance and hatred who have no one to remember them. And so I light this light of memory for those who have no one. I mean, we'll read names in just a moment of children whose names were remembered in little bits of biography. But as we light this candle, you remember how many people, how many families, how many communities were just destroyed and disappeared. They have no one to remember. We light this light to do what we can, like Ariana has done with just an amazing amount of time and energy, to bring those threads of memory forward so that they can be shared. We read together, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu ha'or shel yizkor. Praise are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who gives us the light of memory. As we look into this light from this candle, and we honor the memory of the people touched by the Holocaust, we read Hannah Senish's final words to her comrades before she was executed by a firing squad in November of 1944. She said, "There are stars whose radiance is visible on earth, though they have long been extinct, and there are people whose brilliance continues to light the world, though they are no longer among the living. These lights are particularly bright when the night is dark." In January 1945, the wheels of destruction in Auschwitz stood still. There were few people left alive to describe the prevailing silence of death. Those who came out of the hiding after the war, out of the forests and the monasteries, and we hear even from where they were hiding in Berlin, they also described the shock of liberation as freezing, crippling silence. Nobody was happy. Survivors stood at the fences in amazement. Human language, with all of its nuance, turned into a mute tongue. Even words like horror or monster seemed meager or pale, not to mention words like anti-Semitism, envy, and hatred. Such a colossal crime can be committed only if you mobilize the darkest of the dark of the soul. To imagine such a darkness apparently needs a new language. Together, in times of padness, pain, sadness, and repentance, our tradition says to fast. Now we take this time to remember we start with the Tzom Shetikia, a fast of silence rather than a traditional fast from eating. Like Aaron in Leviticus standing in silence in response to the death of his two sons, we stop in conscious, active, awesome, heavy silence. May our shared silence lead us to awareness of the time of total evil that degraded our most precious values, the very meaning of religious existence and life itself. Our silence is to be committed, accounting for other silences that accepted persecution and were indifferent to debasement and crime. And I do ask you to please rise. And so as we take in the story that we share, as we prepare to bring forth these butterflies as an act of protest of bringing beauty into the world, we take a moment of silence. In Passover, we say Dayenu. It would have been enough as we recount the miracles that God did for the people of Israel. Even if we stood for 6 million seconds, even 6 million seconds of silence, Dayenu, it would not be enough to really do what we would need to do. As we feel that silence, we also respond with words, and I invite you to read together with me. May God remember our brothers and sisters of the house of Israel who gave their lives for the sanctification of the divine name. Here we remind ourselves again that no earth covered the multitude of murdered Jews, that no Kaddish was recited, that no kin was left to remember them. Let our voices honor their memories. As we read first in English these words of El Malei Rachamim, and then we will hear the words in Hebrew together. Exalted and compassionate God, grant perfect peace under your sheltering presence among the holy and pure, the souls of all of our brethren, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered and burned in their ghettos and concentration camps. May their memories endure, inspiring faith and loyalty in our lives. May the shelter of love and remembrance extend to embrace all who died in this Holocaust. May they rest in peace as together we say, Amen.
El Malei Rachamim Shochem במרומים, אמצעים מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה. יהים קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, ונשפוט 6 מיליון שנהרגו estirim besekter kena favle olamim. Vitzror, vitzror, hachayim et nishmatam. Adonai hu nachalatam. Ve'anuchu beshalom, beshalom, al mishkavam ve'nomar. Amen.
As we prepare to say Kaddish, we say a poem that I hope is familiar to at least to some. We say Kaddish when we remember what our Torah teaches. Love doesn't die, people do, so when all that's left is me is love, give me away. As we say Kaddish, in this observance for Yom HaShoah, we temper the affirmation of life and the words of praise with the names of the places of death. Destruction, the senseless hatred of the Shoah, the fact that these deaths reflect the worst of humanity's evil inclination, demands a different kavanah as we praise God. And so we join together as we say this very different act of Kaddish. Yitgadal loads, the Yitgadash gurs, Shemei Rabbah Varsa,
Be'alma divra chirute Boganovka, Ve'amlich malchute Ravensbrück, Shvachayechon uvyomechon Vilna, Ufayet uchol Beit Yisrael Treblinka, Ba'agala uvisman kariv
V'imru,
Hamna, V'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Le'olam Olmei Almaya,
Yitbarach,
V'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar, v'yitromam, Belzek,
Yitpa'ar,
v'yitromam, Buchenwald, v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar, v'yitsobibor, v'yitaleh, v'yithalal, memdainek, Shudusha, Urichu, Mauthausen, Le'ela, Babiyar, Mikol Birchata, V'shirata, Bergen-Belsen, Tushbechata v'nechemata dachau, damiram be'alma Auschwitz, v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen.
And even with that list of so many places, one name was not there was Theresienstadt of Terezin, that place in Czechoslovakia that we have heard. We add that name, and not just the names of the places, but we think of the souls that were in those places. This flickering flame captures the in-between mourning, but don't stop living. Forget, but don't get lost. Never forget, but don't get lost in memory. Out of the anger over the injustice, but in kindness bringing justice to our still fragmented world. Just as God's first action was to bring light into the universe God created, it is light calling us to remember and to act. The light returns to the world. Hold on 1 second. Make this a little easier. So too do we return light to the world, and gazing in the light of memory of the service. Now, even as we bask in this light of life, we will extinguish the candle with our breath. For by giving our breath to the world, we nullify the forces that would destroy us. We extinguish this candle with the words of creation that God spoke with our breath, by God's breath bringing light of living world into the world. And so I ask you to join me. We are here as we take in our breath, and we say, as God said, Vayihu, or there was light. With our breath, we extinguish this light, and we think of what we need to do to bring light into our world. Vayihu, or.